we are living at a time that is unprecedented with the level of Jew hatred and anti Semitism, especially to see it coming out of the conservative right
Hmm.
and to see it coming out of Christians, the church. I can't tell you how many snarky, nasty social media posts people put about PJTN support and what we're teaching from a biblical perspective, what we're teaching about Christians and their responsibility to stand with Israel and the Jewish people. Ladies and gentlemen, the word is very clear. And if there was ever a time that we need to be standing on biblical truth, it is now.
Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a podcast from PJTN that focuses the light of truth on vital issues in today's headlines that impact every American. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza Moore, founder and president of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, and I'm here to educate, motivate, and activate you to action. I want to arm you with the truth and the facts you'll need to fight and preserve our constitutional republic and uphold the Judeo-Christian values our nation was founded upon.
Welcome back to Proclaiming Justice, a PJTN podcast. On today's podcast, we are continuing our conversation with Rabbinate Yaffah Batya da Costa about the rise of the replacement theology threat and God's eternal covenant that he made with Israel. During our last podcast, we discussed how in early Christianity, replacement theology played a significant role in fueling hatred of the Jews, especially under Constantine. If you missed the last episode of our conversation with Yaffah, you can find it and our previous podcast lineup on our website at pjtn.org, salemsoneplace.com, as well as all the other platforms that you use to access your favorite podcasts. Yaffah, thank you for joining us again on Proclaiming Justice. Today, I want to continue our conversation about the rise of Christian anti-Semitism, especially on social media, with leading anti-Semites like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens. So let's begin with let's pick up where we left off the last time, which is the scriptures, the New Testament verses that are used to prove that Jesus is God.
Okay. And thank you for having me on again. I really enjoy doing these podcasts with you. And it's very, very important. By the way, I just want to share, there's more and more people on X doing what I'm doing. Jewish people as well as Christian Zionists, biblical Christians, fighting this fight, the same fight that we're talking about. Okay.
Thank God.
Thank God. It's almost like more and more people have had it, with all this stuff.
Oh yeah. Well,
Especially,
in the last days, Isaiah said, chapter 11, it said that Judah and Ephraim would unite together to take on the enemies of Israel. And boy, Yaffah, we are living at a time that is unprecedented with the level of Jew hatred and anti-Semitism, especially. I mean, we expect it from the typical anti-Semites, we expect this, but to see it coming out of the right, the conservative right, and to see it coming out of Christians, the church, I can't tell you how many snarky, nasty social media posts people put about our support, about PJTN support, and what we're teaching from a biblical perspective, what we're teaching about Christians and their responsibility to stand with Israel and the Jewish people. Ladies and gentlemen, the word is very clear. And if there was ever a time that we need to be standing on biblical truth, it is now. We just saw the big scandal with the Heritage Foundation, the leader, the president. We are calling for his resignation or for the board to fire him because he doesn't know the time. He can't even, one of his staff said, not only does he not know the time to which he lives, but he doesn't understand the time. He doesn't know what time it is. And he certainly does it. He takes this with a grain of salt. He doesn't realize that we're heading down this journey. And what's really bothersome is that this Heritage Foundation developed the task force to combat anti-Semitism, to which I serve on. So there is an interest in combating anti-Semitism, but when the anti-Semites are in our camp, well, we don't want to expose them. We don't want them to have to go. They're always going to be a friend of Heritage Foundation. It is outrageous, but
Yeah.
I turn it over to you.
Well, the other expose, if you want to call it that happened was with Candace Owens. She had taken some messages, I believe they're emails, but don't quote me. I'm not exactly sure if they were emails, but that's what I think, from a couple or a few years ago between her and Charlie Kirk. And when I first saw this, and I didn't get into what those emails said, I just wrote in an answer to somebody on X, I said, well, all the email carriers, you can get into those emails and forward them. And before you forward them, you can change the content. Now, the font might be different, and, there might be other things that somebody who really knows how to detect this stuff could detect it. But those things can be changed. Well, that just got exposed. Somebody did exactly that. And they exposed the fact that those messages had been changed. Okay. I'm not saying who made the changes, but she apparently put out messages that had been altered or had been edited or whatever you want to call it. Okay. That is so gross that somebody would do that. Okay. But anyway.
And people trust her. People are quoting her. And I see it in some of my text messages. That's why, it's a good thing that what happened with the Heritage Foundation took place, because it is time for Christians and conservatives and Republicans who say that, we are defending our Judeo-Christian values, our Judeo-Christian nation. They have to understand that the problem is with the leadership. We don't have leaders that are willing to stand up and do the right thing. They want to just, brush over these issues that we're finding, that we're raising, that we're addressing. And they're not taking these threats and these comments by these influencers. These are major influencers, and they're not taking it seriously. And that's why it's time for Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, to be removed.
Well, actually, in my view, it's gone past that, what you just said. I think it's a personality cult that Tucker and Candace are creating. So when these things come out, when they get really bad, in what they're saying and spewing really poison into the atmosphere of social media, they're going to lose some people, but then other people will double down, because that's what happens to people who have a cult mentality.
Right.
They can't get out of the cult. They won't permit themselves to get out of the cult, so they kind of like put blinders on, and everything outside the cult is wrong, is incorrect, is hateful, is this and that, because they have to protect the personality of that cult. Okay. It's a mental thing. I'm not saying it's a mental illness, but it's a cognitive thing. Okay. Because any objection to that person and what they're talking about, what they're doing and everything, if they were to accept that, and then you've got what Tucker and Candace and other people are saying on the other side of it, they can't hold those two things in their head, in their mind at the same time. It creates what's called cognitive dissonance. So they have to pick one or the other. They either have to leave the cult, okay, because they recognize that it's a cult, and they're doing things that are absolutely lying, saying things that aren't true, and they're finding that out, or they have to double down and totally ignore all the people who are sharing, the truthful information, the historic information, all this other stuff. Okay, so anyway, going back to the thing about people and especially Christians trying to prove from the first century writings what the Romans did in the 4th century, not just with replacement theology, but the Creed, the Nicene Creed, and all the stuff they did. And by the way, what I'm starting to put out in my messages on X lately, like even today I did it, what I'm writing is that what the Romans did was, in order to pass muster of the people in the Roman Empire who already were Christian, and to drag them into the Roman version of this stuff from the church fathers, like Tertullian and Origen and Justin Martyr and Irenaeus and all these guys, who already had Jew hatred from 3rd century BCE. That's historical record that we have, what happened all the way back in 3rd century in the Hellenistic world. So in order to pull people into what they were proposing or what they were marketing, whatever you want to call it, all right, they had to kick the Hebrew Bible to the curb. So people wouldn't read the Hebrew Bible, which was the foundation of the writers of the 1st century epistles, the letters, and the Gospels, and all of that. That was their foundation, the Hebrew Bible. So they had to kick it. They had to kick it out and call it old. So when they put the canon together, you had the Old Testament. Now you've got this New Testament, okay, of the 1st century writings, and that's the way they put the canon together. But the problem with that is when Paul is talking about the New Covenant or the New Testament that goes with the New Covenant, he's thinking about Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 through 34. And I absolutely believe that Paul believed that was going to come next when Jesus returned, and Jesus said he was going to return, and in that generation, okay, and that was what was going to happen, that all of the prophecies about the Jewish Messiah, King of Israel, and all of that were going to be fulfilled. The temple that existed at that time would have had to have been destroyed or rebuilt in some way for the prophecies about a new temple. Something like that would have happened, whatever had to have happened. But definitely you would have seen in the world what Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34 talks about, that everyone would know God directly. No one would need to teach his neighbor about God. Everyone would know God directly. Everyone, not just Jews, everybody in the world. Okay? And that and the Torah, the word, would be written on people's hearts. But it's the same thing. It's the same Torah. It's just the delivery of the word, instead of being written on stone, which it was during the days of Moses, okay, it would be written on people's hearts. But the words don't change. The covenant or the Torah, whatever you want to call it, doesn't change. It's still all the laws and all the commandments and all the things about serving God, loving neighbor. So when we see people, like you mentioned just a minute or two ago, being nasty and harsh and cruel, the way they come after people who want to talk about this stuff. Again, we have free speech rights as well, you know.
Those, and I just want to remind you, those are Christians.
I know.
Those are people who call themselves Christians. I'm glad you brought up Jeremiah 31 through 34, because I ask Christians all the time, are you a New Covenant believer? Oh, yes. Where did New Covenant start? Where did it come from? They don't even know about Jeremiah 31. And then when I make them read it out loud back to me, then they get the aha, you know, and it helps them to see that there's nothing new under the sun. And this is the promise that God would make with Israel. So when Christians, you know, think that, oh, it's only about the New Testament, it's not about the Old Testament or the Tanakh. The reason why they say that is because they don't know their Bible. They don't think that the Old, or the Tanakh, the Old Testament as they call it, is of value, because now we're operating under New Testament theology.
Right. And the New Testament is the same thing as saying the New Covenant. And it hasn't appeared yet, even over the past 2,000 years. They cannot hear that. They don't have the ability to listen to that, because all that they've been taught is that that's what Jesus of Nazareth came to do. was to create this new covenant. And I'm sure you know, you've had people say to you, I've had people say to me, he was the first Christian. Well, Jews weren't even Christians in Paul's day. Paul was creating communities of Jews and Gentiles or non-Jews, whichever you like. And it was a Judeo-Christian community, but the term Christian was first used in the book of Acts, and was talking about the people in Antioch calling themselves Christians, which in Greek means followers of Messiah, and it was talking about Jesus. They did believe he was the Jewish Messiah or even a potential Messiah. And then when he died, that he would come back. And the Christians say that all the time. Well, he is going to come back and finish the job. That's what I hear a lot of people say on X, okay, on social media. And I say, okay, that's fine. Really, people can believe that. There's no problem with that. But the Jewish world says, okay, but that's speculation. And don't we have a right to our speculation about either who it might be, or we might say, well, we speculate it could be King David returned or even Moses returned. I mean, don't we have a right also to have a speculation that would be different from that? And the answer is, oh, no, of course you do. You can't say that. You can't have a speculation that's different from, if they would agree to call it speculation, but it's more than speculation to them, because what they were taught, and it comes out of the Romans in the 4th century, is that there's a combination of belief in Jesus as the Messiah, and if you don't, you're going to hell. That was the way they did the marketing. Okay, you absolutely decimate the competition, because Judaism was a form of competition. In that day, there were a lot of people who, really liked Judaism and wanted to become Jews and fully convert and all of that. Well, the Romans couldn't have that. Okay.
No, absolutely.
So the Romans had to do two things. They had to, one, change Christianity to be more oriented towards a pagan outlook, a pagan view of a human being as God, like the Roman emperors, like the Greek gods and the Roman gods and all that stuff. So they had to make it palatable for the pagan people in the empire. They had to, and had already, before Constantine, been persecuting the earliest Christians who didn't believe in a human being as God either, again, because of the 1st century writings. There's no place in the 1st century writings that can substantiate that view. Jesus didn't say he was God. His disciples didn't treat him as God. Paul never said he was God. So when I say to people, there's nothing explicit in the New Testament writings, documents, Gospels, whatever, that makes that claim that he's God, that he's a human being and he's God, okay, people get very upset with me. Oh, yes, it does. And I'm going to show you. And the Father and I are one, it's a famous one. Or, I am. Before Abraham came to be, I am. And we did that, I think, in last week's show. So there are a few things that we talked about already. So what I'd like to do is just do a very quick review of one of the most famous and really frequent ones that people use. Then we can move on. Okay. So John chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. Okay, that whole prologue, actually, you can go all the way to verse 18. I think John actually, that Gospel of John starts in chapter 1, verse 19, is what not just me, but some of the Christian scholars, modern day Christian scholars, say the prologue was separate and maybe even came later, was added later. But here's what it says. It says, and I'm going to translate it the way it should be translated from the Greek. Okay?
Okay.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was godly or godlike. Now, in the Christian Bibles, like King James and many of the others, it says he was with God. Actually, it's a pronoun in Greek that could mean he, it can mean it, it can mean through, it can mean a lot of different things in Greek. Okay, so the translation of that prologue to John's Gospel, when it gets translated, people have to understand who's translating it and from what perspective, because it should be translated from context. But another way to translate things is from theology. If you already have a theology, okay, that this is a person that's being talked about here, the word for word, logos, if you already have the belief that it's a person, then you're going to translate the prologue to John that says he, but it could easily be translated as it, not he. A very important point at the very end. So I'm going to say it the other way. It was with God in the beginning, and through it all things were made. Without it, nothing was made that has been made. In it, again, keeps talking about the Logos, in it was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. That light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And at the very end there, the translation does say it. I think they made a mistake. Because in all the other places it says he until it gets to that last verse, verse 5. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. It clearly says it in the translation, okay? But the whole thing can be translated it. And people don't know this, that to translate it with the pronoun he is actually because of already the theology that says that's a person of the Trinity. Now, finally, we get to John 14, John 1:14, and at the end it says, and the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. Okay, but the proper translation, I think we did this last week, last session. The proper translation of the Greek there is the Word was made manifest in the flesh. And that's talking about a righteous person. Okay, because people can see the manifestation, they can see the righteousness of this person. Of course, it's talking about Jesus, and that's fine. There's been plenty of righteous people in the Hebrew Bible. Okay, so it's not outside of Judaism. It's not outside of the context of the day, which is the Hebrew Bible. Right. To say somebody is a righteous, very righteous person. And that's what people believe really John in his prologue is talking about. But again, Christians aren't taught these things, so they don't know. So when they first hear, and I can understand, it's like, what are you talking about? You know, I can understand where they're.
I know. Yeah, I mean, honestly, when people see this, I remember when I first started studying the scriptures from a Hebraic perspective, and I started seeing the mistranslation of the scriptures, and when they're translated in a proper way, in their proper context, it is like, oh my gosh, why didn't we see this before? Why haven't we been taught this?
Right.
It's very frustrating, and I know how people feel. I was there.
Right, absolutely. And it's tragic, okay, because it's not just that the people's feelings get hurt, that they may have been lied to or led along a path that is so clearly now that they can see it, that it's so clearly, off, right, from what the Hebrew Bible said, which was the foundation for both Jesus and Paul and everybody else in the first century. But it's a betrayal, and they feel it as betrayal. And I don't blame them. I don't blame them one bit. So again, like with a cult, the mentality is they either have to leave it, which is very hard, and there's family going to be involved, and there's friends going to be involved, and there may be some unpleasant repercussions from people not understanding, what's this person talking about,
Right.
Especially if they try to do it all by themselves. So there's that possibility, which could keep them, along that path, even though they don't really sort of believe it anymore. And they just kind of are in limbo. They don't really know what to do with it. Or they, again, have to double down and get even stronger in this violation. It really is a violation of the Word of God to even contemplate the idea, and I haven't even gone on X with this yet, but I'm getting ready to, I think, to contemplate the idea that God would do something and make an appearance in this world that he created as a man, okay, when he'd never done that before in the Hebrew Bible. All the appearances of God, it's his presence, it's his spirit. It may be accompanied by some kind of a physical phenomena like
His backside.
Yeah, the backside actually is you're going to see what I've done. That's the backside. You're going to see me in terms of I've just left, and you're going to see what happened as a result of my, appearing. But it could be the cloud of glory, and the pillar of fire in the time of Moses and the Exodus. God appears in the Garden of Eden and talks to Adam and Eve, and there's a wind, there's a ruach, is the Hebrew word. But God is not the wind, and he's not the cloud, and he's not the pillar. Now, the pillar of fire. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, when God is talking to Abraham, okay, the angels have left. There's 3 men that show up, but they're actually angels. They each have a job to do. One is to tell Abraham and Sarah that they're going to have a child in a year. A second one is going to go down to Sodom and Gomorrah and destroy those wicked cities. And the third one is he heals Abraham because he had just circumcised himself. So he's the healer, Raphael. He heals Abraham, but then he heals in the sense of saving Lot and his family from the destruction. Okay, so he both heals and saves in that sense. But after the angels leave, and there's a whole story about Abraham feeding them and this, that, and the other. So he goes back to talking to God. And God says something like this. He asks a question. He says, should I not tell Abraham what I'm about to do? Because he's going to be a mighty nation, and he's going to teach his children and his household to do my ways or to live my ways, something like that, doing justice, doing mishpat, and tzedek, which is charity or, righteousness. Those words in Hebrew can mean different things in context, but also judgment. Because he's going to teach his children and his household. Well, who is his household? It already says children. Aren't they his household? Why does it say children and household? The household are the 318 men, and there may be some women also, men usually the ones that are counted, that they brought with them from Haran. It says in the Torah, they made souls. How can you make a soul, right? They brought these people with them from Haran in that caravan, and they end up in the land where God wanted them to be. So he has a whole household. Who are they? They're God-fearers like Abraham is. And they are worshiping the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, the Torah wasn't even given yet. The rabbis say that Abraham observed the entire Torah, even before it was given at Har Sinai, okay, and his children, Isaac and Jacob, okay, but not the God-fearers. They were observing the moral code that every human being is supposed to observe. Okay, some people think that's 7 commandments. Some people think that's the 10 commandments of the Bible. And, it's viewed differently, but it's essentially the moral code. You don't steal, you don't lie, false testimony, you don't murder, you don't commit sexual, sins and all this stuff, the 10 commandments. So that's who those people of the household were, along with the children. And that's what Paul, I was just going to say, that's what Paul was bringing out to the Gentiles in Asia Minor. Okay,
so in Deuteronomy, there are verses that talk about how it's the sojourner, and so it's not just their family, but the sojourner who is among you obviously is a convert or a servant. But what about, because I've heard this said that Gentiles don't have to keep the Torah, they just need to follow the Noahide laws. But what about those verses that say that even those who are among your household, whether they're
strangers, the ger, whether they're family members, they too have to observe the Sabbath and the Passover and these other holy days.
So there's two types of ger. That means stranger, literally a stranger.
Mm-hmm.
And when it says just ger, you have to use context to figure out what type it is, because there's two versions. One is ger tzedek.
Mm-hmm.
A righteous ger is a full convert. So a full convert is a Jew, like every other Jew. They have to observe Pesach, they have the Passover, they have to observe Shabbat, they have to do everything any regular Jew does. Okay? And then there's the ger toshav, which in the land in ancient times was a stranger who, at least at the bare minimum, was observing the Noahide laws, or if you will, the Ten Commandments version, but it was the person who had at least renounced and stopped engaging in idolatry of that kind of those days, and had renounced any interest in murder, sexual immorality, all the other stuff.
Right.
And this is what a lot of people don't know, they could take on additional aspects of the Torah, like eating kosher. There are a lot of Noahides today that eat kosher. They buy kosher food from kosher merchants,
right,
butchers and stuff. They could take on Shabbat like Charlie Kirk was doing as a day of rest, but not observing it the way the Jews observe it. And there's no need to observe it the way Jews do, with 39 categories of creative labor that we don't do on Shabbat. There's no requirement for that. And so Charlie, the way I understand the way he described it, he would shut off his phone. Maybe they would shut off the TV as well. And they would have family time and food, of course, and the 3 meals, and just play with the kids and just focus on the family. There are a lot of people who do that.
Mm-hmm.
Who absolutely do that, who observe Shabbat, and they're not Jews, but that's the way they observe it. So people can take that on, and kosher food and all kinds. The only thing that's taught by the rabbis is to not do, that's a part of Torah, is to wear tzitzit, the fringes from the four-cornered garment. Even a kippah, a non-Jewish man who's praying in a synagogue will wear a kippah. That's not a problem. And as long as they tell the gabbai, the secretary, okay, that he's not a Jew, so that he's not counted with the Jewish men. They have to have a minimum of 10 Jewish men, okay?
Right.
So they don't want to appear like they're a Jew, but they're not. Okay, that would be deception. That would be wrong. So they will tell the secretary, who they are, whatever, if they're not already known. Let me do this for you. What if you saw a man dressed up like a Hasidic Jew, fringes, flying in the wind and everything, okay,
Right.
walking into a non-kosher restaurant? What would you think of that person?
Mm.
Would you give him the benefit of the doubt that he's an observant Jew, an Orthodox Jew, if you prefer, and he just needs to use the bathroom? We're not even allowed to do that.
Mm-hmm.
We are not even allowed to do something that would have the appearance of us violating the Torah.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So if somebody is dressing that way and they're not Jewish, and then they're going to do something that a Jew wouldn't do that is against the commandments for a Jew to do, they're going to do that and create the appearance that there's this Jew that's violating the Torah.
Right.
How could somebody do that? I mean, that's deception. So that's the only thing that non-Jews are prohibited from is the signs. They're called the signs, like putting a mezuzah on the door. So you go to somebody's apartment, okay, in a building, and there's a mezuzah on the door. Are you going to think they're Jewish people living there?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And what if they're not? But they like the idea of a mezuzah, so they're going to put a mezuzah on their door. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
No, absolutely not. Okay, because maybe they're on Shabbat, maybe they're going to leave that apartment and be seen leaving that apartment where there's a mezuzah on the outside of the door, leave that apartment on Shabbat, get into a car and drive off.
Yeah. I see. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's
That's why we're supposed to avoid even the appearance of impropriety.
right, exactly. And
Good example.
exactly. Christians in the early nascent Christianity, the first century, did that as well. And then you have the book of Acts that has Paul going to Jerusalem to meet up with the leaders of the Nazarenes. The Jewish believers in Jesus were never called Christians, they were called Nazarenes. It's a sect in Judaism historically. It's written about in history books. Okay, so he goes to Jerusalem. Guess what he did? He brought money with him for the poor in Jerusalem. How did he do that? He collected the money. He was taking up a collection and teaching people to give tzedakah, to give to the poor. And that was one of the draws in Christianity also, by the way, that they had this thing that civil matters, there was no difference between slaves and women compared with men. There was this elitism in the Roman structure that Augustine had created, the Caesar Augustus, rather, not Augustine, Caesar Augustus, that, had the elite layer and then, I don't know, whatever layer after that. But at the bottom were slaves and women and whatever else, and they were treated differently. They were treated very badly, as a matter of fact, very poorly. So the Christian way of doing it, where you had these communities where you had Jews and Gentiles together, but all the people were treated the same. There was equality in these communities, and that was a huge draw. And they would collect money for the poor, which comes from the Torah, and giving tzedakah. There was all kinds of things that they did in Paul's communities that were absolutely straight out of the Torah, that these people chose to do. They were being taught, this is the way to live, this is the way to do right, right by God and all this stuff. So it was very Judaic, it was very Hebraic. Of course, they were reading from the Hebrew Bible, all that stuff. This is what Christians don't understand. That way of being a Christian and believing in Jesus as the Messiah, no problem. They did believe. Turned out he didn't fulfill the prophecies, but I believe they were very sincere in their beliefs in him. And there are people who still think, well, he's going to be the one who returns at the end of days and is the ending, the real ending machine. They believe that. That's fine. There's no problem with that. There was no problem with that to begin with. The Romans messed the whole thing up with what they did and making Christianity, which was totally Gentile at that time, because the Jews fell off the wagon, seeing what was going on, seeing the way, the direction it was headed towards paganism and pagan rituals and customs and practices and everything, and finally declaring him to be God in the Nicene Council. The Jews couldn't go along with that. So in the end, it was totally non-Jewish religion. Okay. But then they said, as you know very well, and the Christians are the new Israel. So now all the prophecies in the Hebrew Bible that haven't been fulfilled yet are only going to be fulfilled for Christians, not for Jews. Jews are cursed. God revoked his covenant, his eternal covenant with them. This is what they were taught, what the Romans taught. So people,
they're still teaching. Even the Romans, it's been handed down, it's still being taught. And that's what's so frightening. And when I hear these people who say, they want to go back to the foundation of Christianity, and they're going back to the Catholic Church or the Greek Orthodox Church, I'm saying to them, you're not going back far enough. The original foundation of the Christian faith was the Hebrew, was in Judaism. And so are there some people that are, converting to Judaism and studying with the rabbis? Probably. But people don't understand, they don't realize what the foundation of Christianity was. And all the connections, like what Yaffah just went through explaining to us, all of the little nuances and the things that we believed, or that Christians believe and practice, they don't understand where that came from. So, I tell people, you got to go back, you got to go a step further, keep going. Don't stop.
well, if a person wants to be what I call a biblical Christian, meaning it's the Bible, meaning it's the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible combined, because the NT writings were based on the Hebrew Bible, and they quoted the Hebrew Bible. Jesus is quoted as saying the Shema in Mark chapter 12. He quotes Deuteronomy 6:4. He quotes Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor as yourself. This hate business is totally against God's will, totally against God's law for both Jews and Christians. Now, here's the thing. The other thing I want to share is I want to go back to that Greek word. I found it in my notes here. It's called dia. It can be translated through, by, because of, for the sake of. It can also be translated as through, or through somebody, through him. So I have John 3:16. Now, John 3:16 has been used for, I don't know, the whole 2,000 years, I'm sure. Okay. But really back to the Roman times, to say that if you don't believe this, you're going to a very bad place. Let's put it that way.
Right.
But here's the way to be translated from the Hebraic view, okay, using the Old Testament or, the Jewish scriptures, the Hebrew Bible. So I'm going to read it the way it should be translated, okay? This is John. John wrote his gospel. We don't really know who this John is, by the way, but just to remind you that, and our listeners, that all the gospels were written anonymously. But anyway, they gave the name for this gospel to be John. It was written between 90 and 110 of the Common Era. Okay. So here it is, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he, meaning God, gave his only son, God's son, and Son of God, by the way, is a title of the Messiah. Doesn't mean he's God. It's a title of the Jewish Messiah, Son of God. Gave his only son that whoever believes, and the belief there is in God. So I'm going to say it because it's not in the text, but I'm going to say what it means. Whoever believes in God, because it's implied, through him, the Son, should not perish but have everlasting life. It's belief in God that's the foundation. Through the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. That's what they believed. He was a teacher. He was a rabbi. He was a teacher of the law and the covenants. Okay?
Right.
So how could he claim to be God? He never would have been able to claim that. His disciples never would have been able to agree with that and worship him. Okay? It's totally against or in opposition to the Torah and the Hebrew Bible. So that's the only way to understand John 3:16 from the standpoint of a Hebraic view, meaning the Hebrew Bible as the background, if you will, or what's in your head, rolling around in your head, okay, that it's the belief in God through him, the Son, meaning his teachings, that if that's who they are, they would not perish but have eternal life. That, there's no problem with that. The Jewish people would have no problem with that statement.
Right.
And finally, I'll state Paul's statement about salvation. Okay, what Paul is really talking about, and it's true, and I'm going to show you, I'm going to prove to you it's true also from the Jewish point of view. Paul's statement about salvation goes like this: ye are saved, y'all, as we'd say in Texas, all y'all are saved by grace, which is a free gift of God, by the way, saved by grace through faith. Faith in God is implied. Paul was always talking about faith in God from Romans chapter 1, verse 1 and forward.
Right.
Saved by grace through faith, and not of works, he means works of the law, lest any man should boast. Okay? So it's very, very clear that salvation is based on faith, and that faith is faith in God.
Right.
Okay? All right. I mean, that's first century Judaism as well as first century Christianity. Now, I'm going to prove to you that this is also Jewish or Judaism. Okay?
Okay.
At the Song of the Sea, which is Exodus chapter 14, so people can look it up. Exodus chapter 14, verses 30 through 31. They're at the sea. The sea has just split in the story. The sea split, and the Israelites walked across that territory on dry ground with the walls of water on either side. If you remember the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer
Oh, yeah.
movie.
Yeah, absolutely. The Hollywood version.
The Hollywood version, exactly. Okay, so you can picture that in your mind. So the Israelites are walking through, and walls of water on either side, and they're walking on dry ground. Okay, so they get to the other side, and the Egyptian army with their chariots and their horses and everything is coming very fast behind them, and they get into that area of the walls of water, and the walls come crumbling down, so to speak, and they drown. And now the Israelites are on the other shore, of course, and they're seeing all these dead bodies, these dead Egyptians, okay, because they've been drowned. Now this is called the Song at the Sea, and here's how it starts. Now they've just left Egypt, okay? They're not at Mount Sinai yet. They haven't received the Torah yet. They're not there yet. They're right on the shore of the Dead Sea, and they see all the dead Egyptians. So here's what it says. Exodus 14, verses 30 and 31. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day, and the word Lord there is, of course, the tetragrammaton. Okay, the word we don't say, the name we don't say, rather.
Right.
Thus the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hands of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore. And Israel saw the great work which the Lord did upon the Egyptians. And the people feared the Lord, or revered, it can also be translated revered, the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. That's where it shows they had faith. After all they had seen, after the 10 plagues, after the drowning of the Egyptian army, chasing after them hot and heavy, now it says they believed in the Lord and his servant Moses. And you can read the rest of the Song at the Sea for all the other stuff they said in the song. Then they go to Mount Sinai and get the Torah. So the works comes after. The works is a commandment that God gave to his people Israel, okay, to set them apart. That's what that's about. The works of the law is about setting the people apart from the 70 nations, and not because we're superior. I've seen this on X also, people saying, oh, the Jews think they're better than anybody, they're superior. No. And besides that, we didn't choose us. God.
That's right. God chose Israel, all 12 tribes.
So go complain to God that he chose us.
That's right. That's right.
But the point is, it's not about superior status, and there's no individual human being ever, any kind of human being, superior or better than anybody else. We're all the same. God loves us all. And by the way, that's what I'm quoting lately on X, is read Psalm 145. It doesn't even mention Jews. It says God loves everybody.
Yeah.
And he helps everybody. So Psalm 145, which we believe in I read it every day, which we believe in very strongly. And we're taught this in Judaism. You know, you don't put people down because you're not a Jew. Who do you think you are? So,
Absolutely.
I mean, if somebody were to try to do that.
Well, Yaffah, we have about 3 minutes left of this segment, and we still didn't get through. So you'll just have to come back next week. And we're going to have to pick up where we left off. And ladies and gentlemen, I hope you found this program informative. It is so interesting. I just love hearing Yaffah teach and helping me to expand my understanding of the Hebrew text of the Bible. You know, we're going to post this podcast on our website and all of our podcast platforms so that you can share with your family and friends. As PJTN Watchmen, we have a biblical mandate to stand against this ungodly rising Nazi threat that is destroying this nation and other Western nations, threatening our Judeo-Christian values and promoting anti-Semitism. We cannot remain silent. God warned the prophet Ezekiel about the responsibility of the watchman. We better stand guard, and we better sound the alarm when we see the enemy advancing, or if any innocent blood is shed, it's going to be required of us. So please share and like this podcast to help sound the alarm in your community. Dietrich Bonhoeffer reminded us that silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak, not to act is to act. Don't forget to join us on next week's podcast as we continue our conversation about combating the rise of anti-Semitism and taking back local control of our communities and our children's education. Your generous monthly donation will ensure that PJTN remains on the front lines and in the headlines. But we can't do it without your faithful prayers and financial support. So I hope you will prayerfully consider supporting our mission as we educate to activate Jews, Christians, and all people of conscience to stand on the front lines of this all-encompassing war. God bless you and thank you for all you do on behalf of our Jewish brethren, the State of Israel, and these United States. Thank you again for joining me on this edition of Proclaiming Justice. Please share this podcast with your family and friends. For more information about how you can get involved, please visit our website at pjtn.org. As a PJTN Watchman, you can help us keep up the fight to preserve our freedom for our children and their children for such a time as this.